Pause whatever you're doing for just 10 seconds, because one single government move has completely tilted the mining landscape. A $1.6 billion check was written to a company most people couldn't recognize if it walked past them on the street. But the part that should really snap your attention isn't the size of the money. It's what the government demanded in exchange. This wasn't a friendly subsidy. It wasn't a symbolic show of support buried in a boring press release. This was the US government stepping in and taking an ownership position in a mining company, effectively placing a long-term wager on where the world is heading over the next decade. And if you think this story only lives in some obscure corner of the market, I'm telling you right now, you're focusing on the wrong headline. At the same time, there's a renewed push to build a national stockpile of critical minerals. And this isn't just an American move. Other major economies are lining up to do the exact same thing. That tells you one thing very clearly. The minerals race is no longer theoretical. It's happening, it's funded, and it's getting louder by the day. It's Tuesday, January 27th, 9:12 a.m. New York time as I'm recording this. Drop a comment with the time you're watching. I genuinely like seeing how far these conversations travel. And quickly, before we continue, I'm actively running a campaign to eliminate copycat channels. If you value the work I do here, hit subscribe and comment John AG, so YouTube knows who you actually came to hear. Also, check the description once the video ends. There are bonus links there, including access to a premium WhatsApp channel and the channel membership option. All right, let's get into what just happened, why it matters, and how you can think about positioning yourself without getting played. I'm John AG. My goal is simple: translate complex market moves into plain English before the narrative gets diluted, recycled, and stripped of context everywhere else. Nothing in this video is personal financial advice. I don't know your situation. My job is to lay out the map, the risks, the opportunities, and the traps. You decide which lane you're driving in. Now here's the shocker. The US government wrote a $1.6 billion check to a rare earth-focused company and took roughly a 10% equity stake. Sit with that for a moment. The government didn't just support the industry, it became a meaningful shareholder. That's not passive encouragement, that's securing a seat at the table. And you can already feel the market trying to tell two different stories at the same time. Story number one says, this is patriotic industrial policy, nothing unusual, move along. Story number two says, this is a speculative bubble, and the smart move is to fade it. Both narratives miss the real signal, which isn't the headline, it's the behavior. When governments move from speeches and incentives to actual ownership stakes, they're not reacting to price charts. They're reacting to vulnerability. They're admitting something quietly but clearly: dependence is no longer acceptable. And once that realization happens, the spending doesn't stop with a single check. It spreads across agencies, procurement rules, standards, contracts, and long-term planning. The only people consistently surprised by that are the ones still trading today's market using yesterday's playbook. Rare earths sit right at the crossroads of defense, energy, and advanced electronics. If any one of those sectors gets disrupted, the economy feels it. If all three experience pressure at the same time, politics shifts. These metals have names that sound like they belong on a chemistry test you forgot to study for. You don't need to memorize them, you just need to understand what they do. They enable powerful magnets and specialized components that modern machines simply can't replace. Electric motors, precision-guided systems, radar arrays, satellites, drones, wind turbines, electric vehicles, robotics, even the tiny components inside everyday electronics that people assume are mostly plastic now. Here's the uncomfortable truth that's been hiding in plain sight for years. The world isn't short on rocks, it's short on processing. Pulling material out of the ground is one challenge. Separating it, refining it, and turning it into usable material at industrial scale is the real bottleneck. That middle step is where leverage lives. For decades, that leverage became concentrated, not because other countries couldn't do the work, but because it was messy, expensive, environmentally controversial, and politically inconvenient. So much of the West outsourced it. That looked efficient, until it wasn't. Because once you give up control of the middle of the supply chain, you lose control over timelines, pricing, and leverage. And if you're thinking, would anyone really use that leverage? I want you to stop thinking like a tourist and start thinking like a strategist. If a competitor can slow you down without firing a single shot, they will. They don't need outright bans. They can tweak permits, require licenses, redefine export categories, adjust one or two materials, and suddenly entire industries feel the ripple effects. That's why stockpiles matter. That's why domestic processing matters. And that's why this $1.6 billion check isn't about a company. It's about a system. Most people still misunderstand rare earths. They aren't rare because they don't exist. They're rare because it's difficult to get them where you need them, in the form you need, at the moment you need them. Some deposits are chemically complex. Some require specialized separation techniques. Some create waste streams that make politicians nervous. So the real competition becomes who can do this safely, reliably, at scale, and at a cost that makes sense. Even if you love free markets, the reality is governments are going to choose winners in strategic materials, not because they're good at it, but because they're afraid not to. The company at the center of this story says it's building a full mine-to-magnet supply chain inside the United States. That includes sourcing the material, processing it into refined products, and manufacturing magnets and components domestically, so defense and industry aren't scrambling overseas when it matters most. The plan ties together a large deposit in Texas and a proposed magnet facility in Oklahoma. Yes, mining timelines are slow. When people hear first production in a few years, they roll their eyes. But in mining, a few years is fast. What makes this different is that processing and manufacturing can come online sooner, creating near-term milestones instead of a decade-long waiting game. Markets hate waiting. They'll pay for visibility, they'll pay for progress, and they'll punish delays aggressively. That turns this into a catalyst machine. Permits, construction updates, equipment delivery, customer announcements, offtake agreements, and government procurement. An offtake agreement, by the way, is simply a commitment from a buyer to purchase your product once it's produced. And it can make the difference between a project surviving or failing. Here's the key question to keep in your mind, because it unlocks the entire story. Why would the government take an equity stake instead of just offering incentives? Because this isn't only about profit, it's about control. When you own part of the vehicle, you have more influence over where it goes. But government involvement doesn't eliminate risk. Sometimes it introduces new ones. Political shifts, public scrutiny, changing priorities, and the temptation to chase headlines instead of execution. So, yes, we can be constructive, but never blind. Now zoom out. Rare earths are the spark, but the fire is larger. Physical materials matter again. For years, investors were trained to believe the future was purely digital, apps, software, cloud. But the cloud is built from metal and concrete. Data centers, transformers, substations, turbines, cables, cooling systems. AI doesn't reduce physical demand, it multiplies it. AI at scale is an industrial project, and industrial projects come with shopping lists. More chips, more servers, more networking gear, more cooling, more backup power, more grid infrastructure. And here's the hidden constraint few people talk about: power delivery. Based on recent industry updates, the biggest bottleneck for new data centers isn't computing hardware. It's electricity and the equipment needed to move it. Utilities are seeing interconnection requests far beyond normal planning horizons. In some regions, grid timelines are stretching because key hardware simply isn't available. Large transformers can have lead times measured in years. High voltage switchgear gets back-ordered. Even permits for new substations can turn into political battles. When that happens, the build-out doesn't stop. It reroutes, it throws money at the bottleneck, and that money flows straight into commodities. Now layer in reliability. Data centers don't just need power, they need constant power. That means redundancy, backup generation, battery systems, all of which require more copper, nickel, aluminum, and specialized materials than typical industrial buildings. This is where metals come in, and where people either make disciplined money or emotional mistakes. Copper is essential. It doesn't scale quickly. New supply takes time. Inventories have been drawn down. When demand accelerates, price pressure doesn't ask for permission. Steel and aluminum show up everywhere in hyperscale infrastructure. Specialty materials like gallium, germanium, graphite, and high-purity silicon don't matter until they're missing. And then they matter more than anything else. This is why stockpiles change markets. They create buyers that aren't price-sensitive. They tighten physical supply even when paper markets look calm. If multiple governments build stockpiles at once, demand can surprise everyone. Before we talk specific names, here's what saves people pain. Most investors lose money in hot themes, not because the theme is wrong, but because they treat it like a lottery ticket. They buy late, they don't know what they own, and they have no exit plan. You want three things: a real catalyst, a realistic timeline, and a balance sheet that can survive delays. Mining companies don't die because the story is wrong. They die because the story takes longer than the cash lasts. So I build watch lists around questions, not tickers. Cash levels, burn rates, milestones, customers, funding paths. And I plan exits before entries. If you don't know what makes you wrong, you're not investing, you're hoping. The broader setup looks like the early stages of a metal cycle driven by electrification, AI infrastructure, and defense spending, with supply constrained by years of underinvestment. You can't click to scale mining. Decisions made a decade ago shape today's market. That brings us back to the $1.6 billion check. It's not an isolated headline, it's a signal. So here's my question to you. Is this a one-off move or the start of a broader government push into strategic metals? And if power becomes the next AI bottleneck, which metal do you think surprises people the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with one person who still thinks the cloud is weightless. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next wave of news in this space will move fast. The goal isn't to be first. It's to be early enough with a plan so you're not someone else's exit liquidity. This is educational content based on my analysis of publicly available information and market behavior. It's not financial advice, it's not a recommendation, and it's not tailored to you.